Let's take a look at some of the similarities and differences between Studio One and Pro Tools when it comes to automation. All right, let's get started. The very first thing that I want to talk about is if we work in Pro Tools and we, for example, let's do a stereo aux input, and we add this, we get a track immediately. And then from this track, we can adjust things like volume automation. If I wanted to bring up something like a plugin, for example, and I wanted to automate something like master bypass, maybe even let's add a couple more over here. We'll click OK. This is where we can do all of our automation. Let's open up our envelopes and we'll go to any one of these parameters. This can be automated, and this all is happening from the arrange window. So, like I said, in Pro Tools, aux channel, automat, or rather aux track, the arrange window, aux track in the mixer. Let's go to Studio One for a moment. By default, when you work with Studio One and you start it for the very first time, this will not be the default behavior. So I'm going to add a bus channel, and notice that the bus channel was added, but nothing happened. Now let's go over here, let's add an effects channel, and let's add a VCA channel. So notice that I've added them in my console, but we don't actually see them in the arrange window. This is very similar to the way that Logic behaves. I don't know about other DAWs, but the two main DAWs that I have experience with are Pro Tools and Logic. How do we get a track for this channel that we've created? Well, it's actually similar to Logic. We right-click, and if you need a track to be able to automate something or whatever the case might be, you just click this edit option. And then we have the option to edit the automation, and everything as well. All is good in the world again. Everything makes sense in terms of the way we're used to seeing things from a Pro Tools style workflow. Okay, so what if you want this to happen by default, which is the way that I like to work, quite simply because it's the way that I'm used to. Now, maybe you don't want it to work like this. Maybe you'd rather work where you want to add them one at a time as you need them. If that's the case, everything's fine. Leave it as is and you'll be happy. If you do though, then you want to go to your Preferences, Advanced, click the Automation tab, automatically create automation tracks for channels. So let's click Apply and OK. I'm going to select both of these and let's remove them. Also, let's select this one and let's remove it. Okay, so now, same thing again. Add a bus channel, boom, there's our automation track. Add a FX channel and a VCA channel. So this is the way that I like to work by default, and I have a feeling that if you're coming from Pro Tools and you're used to Pro Tools, especially if you're doing a lot of automation, that this is the way you are going to want to work as well. What this means is that even if we have our console closed, for example, if I select bus 1, I have access to all the inserts and sends, effects, I have access to the inserts and the VCA channel. I have access to anything that I need here if I'm viewing the inspector. But other than that, we just have that one-to-one linking where if we have any parameters, or if, for example, we have a plugin, maybe over here, Pro EQ, then we can make everything work the way that we're used to. Okay. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out. Now, while we're on this subject, if you recall in the very first video, I mentioned that we were going to come back to automation tracks, because when we have the add tracks option and we go to the type, we have audio, which makes sense, self-explanatory, instruments, also pretty self-explanatory, folder tracks, which we covered. Folder tracks can either be linked to a bus or a VCA channel, or they can just be a folder track. That's really good for housekeeping. And then automation track. So when we have these automation tracks, we have these tracks that are kind of just floating out in the middle of nowhere, but what are they linked to? Okay, so let's remove these selected tracks for now. Let's hop over to Pro Tools for a second. Now, in Pro Tools, when you have a track in the arrange window, and you have, for example, a plugin where you're automating different parameters, like we see over here, there's 4 different automation parameters that are linked to this one plugin. They're all nested on the same track. So if you have plugins on aux1, then your automation for anything on aux1, it's on aux1. It might be nested in this menu over here. For example, I'm in volume. I would have to go down here and I could choose the very specific areas that we have. So Studio One doesn't quite function this way, in that you can have, for example, an automation track that is linked to something completely different. You could have all of your tracks open and maybe you want to see automation tracks that control the volume automation of your lead vocal and maybe your lead guitar or something like that. And you don't necessarily need to have them linked to the channel that they're part of. Now, I don't want to overly confuse anything here. So what I'll do is I'll make a public statement and say that I always try to have these linked to the channel because that's the way my brain works. That's the way I'm used to working in Pro Tools. Now, there are other power users who would disagree with me big time, and they'd say, no way, I want to have the control. An automation track should be able to control everything. It's not the way my brain works because I've been doing this since 2000 or whatever version Pro Tools 5 came out is, and I can't program my brain to think about anything differently. So I'm going to show you how to do things two separate ways. We're going to show you how to do it the way that I do it, where everything is linked by default, and then we'll take a look at a different way that you can do it if you want to do it that way. Okay, so first things first, this is pretty easy. Bus channels and effects channels and VCA channels. By default, if you have that preference enabled, it will create an automation track that is linked to the channel in the console. And I think this is a good thing. It's very easy. We select it. It selects this one. This kind of works the way a Pro Tools user would expect, in my personal opinion. Okay. Now, let's go a step further with this. Okay. Temporarily, we're going to step away from the automation tracks because I don't want to go too overboard with that. And let's talk about the basics, right? We have this bass track over here. We have very simple automation modes. We have a read mode. We have a touch mode. We have a latch mode, and we have a write mode. Then we have the ability to add and remove specific parameters. Now, this really only becomes useful or rather relevant when we have multiple parameters that are available to automate. For example, something like on a plugin. So if I adjust this, we could choose the inserts and we could choose these different parameters, and then we could add this and then we could close it. That is very, very boring, and that is a huge pain in the butt to me to have to do that. Now, when I do look at this, if we expand these envelopes, very similar to the way that Pro Tools works, now this plugin parameter that I automated in that really, really tedious way is available, and I can adjust this. And then if we go into the actual plugin itself, you'll see that that would move as we went across. Now, that is not the way that I work at all whatsoever. Not even close. There's a much easier way to do that when we talk about working with automation parameters within things. Now, first things first, let's talk about something. Let's do a Pro Tools comparison with Studio One. If we select a track, let's expand its height a little bit. We have different views that are available. So for example, we have our waveform view, and then we have like our volume, and then we have our volume trim. But at a given point of time, anytime I push, the minus key beside the main numbers here, I'm switching basically between volume and waveform. These are two very, very useful views. Now, if you have additional automation parameters like mute, pan left, pan right, volume trim, anything like that, you can also switch between these over here, just from this main menu right over here. Let's think of these two views as being track dependent, right? That based on the track that you've selected, you can choose to view the waveform or the automation. Let's go back into Studio One for a moment. If I click this button over here, Show Automation, ignore the shortcut because I've changed it from the default. Show Automation, then anything that has automation, it's going to show all the automation for that. That might be useful. Think of that in terms, again, of a logic context where we click A in logic and all of our automation shows up. If you want this to kind of function in the Pro Tools way, we have an option to right-click this track and show the automation. Now, this is just for the specific track. And in this case, it actually becomes more familiar with Pro Tools in that, let's hide our inspector for a moment, we can choose the display that we want. This is display off, so think of this as like a waveform view. Then we have our volume, then we have our panning. Now keep in mind, in Studio One, our panning is either our pan parameters, they are, how would I say this? We don't have two separate panners. We just have one, which is kind of like a stereo thing. So we don't have pan left and pan right per se. Now the next one we have is that parameter that we automated, which is this one over here, our low cut slope. Like I said, there's a much easier way to do this. If we open up Studio One, any parameter that I touch, I'm going to click and touch this, Option or Alt-A. Boom. If I want to automate this, Option or Alt-A. Boom. If I want to automate this parameter over here, Option or Alt-A. If I want to automate this, Option Alt-A. Option Alt-A, based on whether you're using Mac or PC. That will allow you to very quickly touch any parameter and be able to automate it. Now, notice how many different parameters that I have over here. Now, I can cycle through these by clicking H. That will cycle through every single one incrementally, right? It'll go down the list. So if I go down this list, the next one will be low cut active. This will allow me to cycle through all of these. Now, if I wanted to cycle backwards, I can click Shift H. So this allows you to have a track-based view, and you're basically toggling through all the different automation modes one at a time. And you're seeing the waveforms, and you're seeing the automation superimposed over the waveforms. Now, this might be the way that you like to work if you're used to working with Pro Tools in this context where, for example, you're doing something that, actually, let's go to one where we have a parameter over here. This would be a better example. Let me just zoom in with this a little bit. In this case, we have our aux1, and I'm choosing my different automation lanes over here, just like this. This would be the exact same as working in Studio One and making sure that our automation is enabled, like this, show hide automation, and then just choosing whichever parameter we want from this drop-down menu. Just like that. Now we also have another option. Let's right click and let's hide our automation, and let's open up our envelopes. So any automation that we have will be available as an envelope. And we could also bypass or deactivate certain ones of these just by clicking the power button over here. If I didn't want to bypass this particular parameter that I had, I could just power this down, and then it wouldn't actually automate that area. So based on how you want to work, this is a real easy way to work, is just to be able to add any automation parameter that you want by clicking that Alt or Option A, and then it's going to show up in both the actual envelopes. If you wanted to expand the envelopes, it'll show up here, and also it'll show up if you're in the Show Hide Automation view and you want to get to it right through this drop-down menu, just like this. Okay. Now, I also mentioned one other thing, is that the automation tracks can be separate. I really wanted to kind of drive home the way that it's working first and the way that it's similar to Pro Tools before we talk about how it's different. Because, for example, let's say that you had something that was very, very specific. Maybe, let me try to choose something that kind of makes sense. Let's open up our inspector. We'll double click our Pro EQ. Let's say, okay, well, let's say the gain, this one over here. I'm going to go back to this, and it's going to be global gain. Okay, let's say global gain was super, super important, and we were doing some automation, and I wanted to be able to leave this automation view like this, but I wanted to actually see the track, but I didn't want to have 10 envelopes expanded on the track. In this case, we actually have the ability to basically take this parameter and move it outside if we want, okay? So there's a couple different ways that we can do it. The first way that we can do it is, if it's already created, we can simply just drag this automation parameter. We could move it even to here. So now if I take this and I close the envelopes, notice that the track 7 is the automation track for this particular gain. So that might make sense to some people. I find it a little confusing. The only way that I can really make it work is if I leave it directly underneath the track. Now, I could temporarily pull an automation track out, and then I wouldn't have to be in the automation view per se, either the track-based one and choosing something in particular. So I could leave this set in a normal view, and I also wouldn't have to clutter my screen with all of the automation if I wanted to see the global automation. But what this would allow me to do is work the way that I want to, and I need to show this automation, and basically have the ability to have this automation track sitting outside if I wanted to automate a bunch of different things, okay? Now, there's another way that we can do this as well. So let's expand all these envelopes, and let's actually put this back where it was. We're going to move it back so that it's kind of nested under the main thing. Now, another way that this works is quite simply, and this is something that's really, really nice about Studio One, is that any parameter that you touch, the minute you touch a parameter, like this, for example, notice that in the top left-hand corner over here, we have this hand icon. I can click anything, and then I can drag this hand icon. I can drag it onto the actual track that it's part of, or I could drag it somewhere completely below. So now I have track 7, which is affecting the low-mid frequency gain of this particular plugin of inserts 1 on the bass track. It's giving me some basic information, Pro EQ, low-mid frequency, right? So you have the ability to either click something, click any one of these parameters, and then drag and drop. And this can be drag and drop so it's nested on the main track, or it could be dragged and dropped so that it's on a completely different track. Like I said, this really depends on how you want to work. Some people might love that you can have an automation track that's linked to this one over here, but that's completely sitting outside the arrange window. For me, it confuses the hell out of me, and I can't seem to get it in my brain. So if I was to do this, I would simply reposition this here. But any parameter that you have, for example, let's add another Pro EQ because that's just a great example. This one over here, if I wanted it, I basically have 3 different ways. The easiest one for me is if you want to nest it on the same track, we have our Alt or Option A, and now I've nested this automation parameter. I've added this automation parameter to the main track, okay? That's one way that we can do it. The other way that we can do it is we can simply click this parameter. I'm going to drag my hand over top here, and then I could have the ability to nest it on the same track, right? And if I wanted to drag it to a completely different track where I didn't want it to be part of the same track, again, click this parameter, or in this case, let's click something completely different. Let's click this one. Notice in the top left, the minute you click something, it updates over here. Then it's just a matter of click, hold, and drag, and then this little blue line will allow me to position this individually, independent in a certain area. So this is really going to come down to personal preference. How do you want to work? Do you want to have these tracks as separate automation tracks that can be edited and left in the view of the arrange window, but not necessarily nested to the main track? Or do you want to actually nest them? If you do want to nest them and you don't want to just move them, then it's just a simple matter of opening up the automation, and I can move it so that it becomes part of the track that it was part of. In this case, let me see. Let me make sure I'm on the same one. Oh, whoops, that belongs in drums. So let's close the automation here. Notice that if you do want to put it back, you do have to make sure that you open up the right one, and then you can move it to the actual track it's part of, so that what I see as it being nested in the same track. So to recap, we have an automation view. We can right click. We can show the automation on a track level, which means we have the ability to choose any one of these. The useful key commands here is H to scroll through all of them, Shift H to scroll backwards. If you prefer to work in a way where we're seeing the envelopes, which in Pro Tools would be basically just like adjusting, show, hide the envelopes, and then choosing the different things that you have, then we can do that in Studio One as well. We leave this track in the main view where the show hide automation is not enabled in a track view, and we expand the envelopes, and now I can see all of them. A couple cool things, little side notes. If you have a selection that's made on this track over here, then the hover tools that we're used to seeing in Pro Tools, they will work across everything. So all of these tracks over here. Couple other key differences. I can actually swipe across all of these, select all of these nodes, and move them all up and down together. So now everything up and down together in one unit. That might be useful to you. That might be confusing to you. But regardless, it's an option. So once you kind of understand that you have your track-based automation view, show hide automation, which allows you to scroll and choose these ones, versus your envelopes view automation. Also, we have the ability to have automation tracks that are standalone, which can be useful. Any parameter that we click on a plugin, for example, we have the option to take this hand and then it can be dragged to its own automation track. If you wanted to declutter or clear up things, you have some visibility options in terms of what you're seeing in your channel list over here. And those can be useful at times. But in general, if you're used to the Pro Tools way, I would highly advise going with the option A type workflows, which will automatically nest any parameter that you touch directly within the track itself. It also automatically puts the track into its automation view so that you can just toggle through using either key commands or mouse clicking. And then of course we can return ourselves back and use our envelopes if we need to. Really nice and easy way to work, and once you get used to it, it kind of starts to make a lot of sense. Now, the last parameter that I want to talk about, which can be useful, is the automatically add envelopes for all touched parameters. To be specific, this is very much just talking about when you're working in touch mode. So let's take a look at one last example, shall we? Let's go to our synth track, which doesn't have anything available. I'm going to start off with that preference deselected. We'll click apply and OK. Let's go with the same Pro EQ. So we'll just do this. If I put this in touch mode, right? We'll go to our track and we're going to head to our mixer. Let's put this in touch mode. If I wanted to automate this track, I'll scroll it into view over here. And let me make sure the automation is off here. So this is in touch mode. Now, if I press play, let's solo this out. I'm going to drag this down. We'll let it return. So we're in touch mode over here. And if I open up the envelopes, you can see that the volume envelope over here is being adjusted as I'm making adjustments to this volume over here. But what happens if I do the same thing to the plugin? Okay. Well, it's not returning. It might be the case that you want to try some stuff out, but let's say that you wanted to make an adjustment and you wanted to automate this particular plugin, but you didn't want to have to go to this parameter, for example, and click our Alter Option A function over here. Also worth noting that the plugin automation mode would need to be in touch too. So what I'm going to do is let's undo this so we get rid of that, and let's enable this particular preference. Automatically add envelopes for all touch parameters. We'll click apply and OK. If you are an automation junkie and you absolutely love automating, then this preference is going to be awesome for you, because what this will allow you to do is basically you can just have a field day. So now when this is in touch mode, if I was to press play, anything that I adjust, the minute I automate it, it's going to function with the touch parameter where it's basically going to return itself back to the value. But notice that every one of these envelopes is automatically being created the minute I touch a parameter. Now, this I find extremely useful if I'm trying to dial something in and I don't want to have to add these envelopes one at a time. This can be useful. It can also be a pain in the butt if you're just trying some stuff out and you're not sure that you want to commit to it yet. So this is something that's kind of like, once you know what it is, I would enable it, and then you can make the choice as to if you want to work this way or not. Now, last but not least, we have the paint tool. This is pretty self-explanatory. If you have an automation track, it could be anything. Let's expand this. Maybe let's work with volume, because that's a little bit more relevant in terms of what we're talking about. Let's switch this over to read mode in terms of this plugin automation. When we talk about this, this is just like whatever you choose. It's going to basically function and it's going to go off the grid mode. You want to use a saw. We can invert things just by click, hold, and dragging, just like this. It's very simple. It's going to be snapped to the grid if you're in the grid mode. You can adjust things like this, and freehand, we have our line, we have a parabola. You know what? It's just going to be a case of, if this is the type of thing that you like, then go for it. The one thing that I will say is a little bit different than Pro Tools is the transform tool, which in this case, when you make a transform box selection across something, in fact, let me just zoom in just a little bit, that we have the ability, let's use these ones over here. This will be a better example. We have the ability to kind of compress and expand this, and we can stretch it out, we can double it up, we can change the angle of it. So this would be something that I would advise messing around with a little bit. It's called the transform option, because everything else is pretty self-explanatory. This is the only thing that is really different to Pro Tools. I will use this sometimes if I like what I've done, but I maybe need to compress it or bring it up, or I wanted to change it, or maybe I wanted to lengthen it or something to change the angle. These can be useful tools when we're talking about freehand, but I got to be honest with you. I'll say that for the most part, all of my automation is usually done by adjusting my fader port over here. It's a habit I've got into. And on that note, the last thing would be your reduction level here in Studio One. Think of that as your automation thinning in Pro Tools. That's it for this video. Cover a lot of ground there. In the next video, we are going to be covering, we're going to take a look at some of the different record modes in terms of pre-roll, auto punch, things like that, and how they compare to Pro Tools. So we'll catch you for more in the next video. Cheers.